What are the biggest cost drivers when it comes to state government? I'm Jill Horner. This is Comcast Newsmakers. With me is Pennsylvania State Representative Stephen Bloom. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Jill. It's great to be here.
Let's focus on the overall picture for state government. Obviously, a variety of different components that make up a budget on an annual basis, but there are cost drivers year over year that can be some of the bigger ticket items.
Yeah, and you know, Jill, usually what happens in the budget cycle, in the public discussion, we kind of lose sight of the big picture many times. The press starts to focus and people start to focus on small slices of the pie that are being affected one way or another by a few percentage points here, a few percentage points there. But what we're missing is that there are certain things that continue to drive the cost of government in Pennsylvania up at a rate much past the rate of inflation. So we're growing this government. If you go back to 1970 and look at what we were spending about $4 billion a year. Today, we're well up into the tens of billions of dollars. If you look at and adjust that for inflation, our government costs us 151% more today for the taxpayers to fund than it did back in 1970. And I've met very few people who would even begin to suggest that our government serves us 151% better today than it did back in 1970.
So let's focus on some of those cost drivers. One of these is long-term debt. What are we experiencing here in the Commonwealth?
In the Commonwealth, we've had a track record of continually each year borrowing more and more money to fund operations. And to the point now where we owe tens of billions of dollars, and the interest payments, the debt service on that, has now gone up over $1 billion a year. So if you can imagine that as your credit card payment at home, that's what we've got to pay on a constant basis just to serve the debt that we already have. That doesn't pay it off, that's just the payments. And we're up over $1 billion a year now, even though in the last year we started to reduce the amount we borrow. We've still borrowed too much and we still continue to borrow too much to be sustainable.
Is there a focus on this point, as you mentioned, to work to reduce that long-term debt? And what could that potentially mean moving forward?
Well, what it's going to mean is we've got to make some sacrificial decisions in the short term to get ourselves back on the right track in the long term. And the governor has led the way on that. He's begun to reduce the amount of borrowing quite drastically, and the legislature has backed him up on that. But we're going to have to stay with that. We're going to have to stay disciplined on that, or we'll fall back into the debt cycle.
Let's focus on some of the other issues that you say are important in terms of working to reduce overall costs and overall spending. Pensions is another one. The legislature has actually addressed this issue related to the pension spike, but what about long-term as in terms of a cost driver?
We've got a pension system that's really unaffordable for the taxpayers. We've got state employees and public school employees who have retired or are going to retire with promises made to them that are becoming unsustainable for the Commonwealth tax base to support. Again, we're spending over $1 billion a year now on the state's share of funding these pensions, but that's only going to get worse. If you project ahead just a couple of years, we're going to be in the $4 to $5 billion a year range. And a general fund budget of about $27 billion, that's a huge chunk of the budget that we can't use for state police protection or highways or bridges or other vital functions of the government. We're stuck with this pension system, so we've got to take steps to reform the system rapidly and in a way that we don't continue this unsustainable pattern.
What about corrections? Pennsylvania has been building prisons, but what does that mean in terms of costs and working to actually pay for the people housed, the prisoners within these prisons?
Our prison population has exploded. Again, going back since 1980, we used to have about 7,000 prisoners in the state system. Today we've got about 50,000. At a cost of $35,000 per year per prisoner. Again, it's unsustainable. It's reached up close to $2 billion a year that we're spending on corrections. The Secretary of Corrections is taking some steps, but we've got to increase efficiency in the prison system.
And just a few seconds left, but what role does the state have to play in working to protect the state's most vulnerable residents when it comes to human services?
Public welfare and human services now consumes 40% of our budget. It's the biggest cost driver in the entire state. Obviously, we've got to care for those who are the least of these, who truly need the protection and the help, but we've got to reduce the amount of programs that the taxpayers simply can't afford to fund anymore.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Jill.
We've been talking with Pennsylvania State Representative Stephen Bloom. I'm Jill Horner.